Okay, let's try this again. Recording lecture from home has its own special set of challenges. Not only can I not see you all writing and processing the information that I'm sending to you, I have to contest with my little dog that never shuts up, who's very yappy and just took my garbage and pulled the entire can all the way down the steps. She's a Chihuahua. Forewarning you in case you ever think you might want one. All right, so let's talk about Chapter 11, Medieval Europe. Early medieval art in Western Europe is a result of fusion. It's a highly syncretized product. The Roman Empire calls anybody who doesn't live within the Roman Empire's frontiers barbarians. After the fall of Rome, or after the end of Constantine's reign, then Justinian takes over, and you've got that Christianity with Rome fused together. The outlier areas that are beyond the Roman Empire are still trading with the empire. And so you get this interesting fusion of Rome's classical and Christian fusion, along with the native isn't the right word, the original communities of people that inhabit the territories on the outside of the Roman Empire. So here we're talking about people like the Huns and the Vandals and the Merovingians, the Franks, the Goths, and other non-Roman communities. Those communities already had their own imagery. They already had their own belief systems. Norse mythology comes from the northern European mythological mythology. So they have their own set of belief systems when Christianity and Rome's fusion with Christianity hit their area. It's perpetuated through trade. It's perpetuated through the communities that are indigenous to that land coming in and trying to take over areas of the Roman Empire. Armed conflict is common struggle. We see lots of warfaring between these groups, not only between the groups and the Roman Empire, but between the groups themselves. It's all about establishing control. Oftentimes one group will come into an area, establish control, and then be ousted by another group. We really don't know the full extent of the artistic contributions that the Vikings had on European society, because much of what they had been lost to war and age. Sometimes just a non-appreciative discernment from ancient historians who didn't think that anything but the classical art was worth keeping. Much of what we had has been discarded because the Vikings were not focused on representing art in a realistic and natural way. Most of what we know about the indigenous communities that were there in the beginning are from ship burials, like this one. This is the Oseberg ship burial. It was discovered in Norway in 1904, and it had been plundered by grave robbers long before it was found. Jewelry was all gone, and the furnishings of the ship were still there. The furnishings of the ship included 5 animal post heads. It contained the remains of 2 women who were different in age, clothing, furniture, and a 4-wheeled cart. No one really knows which of the women were the elite one of them, but we know that one woman was sacrificed to accompany the woman who died into the afterlife, which means that the woman who died would have had to have been the aristocrat, and the other woman would have been the one who was sacrificed. Also sacrificed in the burial were 14 horses, 3 dogs, and an ox. There was treasure of jewelry and metalwork. The Vikings buried their elite in sailing vessels, or they buried the vessel in a mound of earth, or they set them adrift in the ocean. This is an animal head post from the Oseberg ship burial. You can see that it is animal-like. We call this the animal style. And then you see this interlacing linear pattern on the side of the animal's head. That interlacing linear pattern we associate with the animal style. I'll show you several works of art that have that interlacing pattern. We call this the animal style because it really doesn't lend itself to one animal. When you look at the Oseberg ship burials post, you see the head of some animal. We don't know whether it's a cat or a bear. Most people tell me they think a bear, a cat, or a wolf. You can see that it had bits of ivory for teeth. The ears were not large and stuck out far. And then you can see that the patterns indicate the different surfaces of the face. So the top has one pattern and then the sides have another pattern, which makes the post read as an animal, but it's not as realistic to define which particular animal. Why? Well, I don't think that the community of indigenous people were really all that concerned with making it look exactly like a bear or exactly like a lion. Did they have the skill to do it? Absolutely. I'm going to show you breathtakingly beautiful works of art who would have had to have had very impressive fine motor skills. But being certain about what the animal looked like really was not important to them. Remember, they lived in a seafaring community, which means they saw animals all the time. They were just part of their natural life. And I think that they decorated with the animal style because it's what they knew the best. But they knew what a bear looked like. They didn't need to replicate it on a wooden post. It didn't serve them any use. Typically, they were representing mythological components of their belief system. So one of the things that the Merovingians were excellent at was metalworking. This is a fibula. It is a piece of jewelry that connects a cloak from the front to the back. When we went through the first golden age of Byzantine, I tried most of the day to recall what that word was for that piece of jewelry that I just could not come up with. It is a fibula. The fibula sort of sandwiches between, well, actually it grabs onto the front and grabs onto the back of the clothing and holds the clothing together so that the wearer is not constantly fiddling with it. People who were of the elite society wore these, and so this jewelry was owned by a wealthy French woman. They were buried with the woman because she thought they would follow her into the afterlife. Just like all of the other prehistoric communities that we have studied, the Merovingians and the Goths and the Franks really weren't any different in that they all looked for the basic thread of humanity, which is, where do we come from and why do things that affect us so deeply happen to us? And so they create their religious and mythological stories are answers to those questions. You can see that the fibula is done in an animal style. At the lower end, you see this bird's face. Here's the beak and the lower jaw and the eye. You can see in the center a fish and a cross. They were experts at enameling and an art called cloisonné. Cloisonné is an enameling technique in which they take bits of glass, melt the glass at a high temperature, and it fills in a color between the metal. Sort of like modern stained glass making. I've never seen someone do cloisonné work, so I can't tell you exactly the process. But anytime you see this like shiny, clear, glassy looking filament in metal, it's cloisonné. King Raold of East Anglia is who we attribute this work of art to. He was at least the owner, we know. It is the purse leg cover from the ship burial at Sutton Hoo in Suffolk, England. The burial was discovered in Suffolk, England by a farmer, and within the ship's hull we found a purse. The pouch or the sack of the purse would have been made out of leather. What you're looking at here is the top lid of the purse that would have opened and closed. The purse would have held change for trade. In the next slide, I'll show you a pile of coins that they found within the rotted leather pouch. The leather pouch was too far gone, and so it's been discarded, but we still have the lid. The lid likely covered part of, or likely had a piece of leather that went underneath it. We see lots of beautiful interlacing patterns. The legs and arms of the mythological creatures are intertwined, and we definitely call this the animal style. We know that these are creatures from mythology because you've got some creatures in the center who seem like they might be representations of humans or gods that gods that are in somewhat of a human form. And then you've got bird-like creatures on the outside of the human form. In the center of the purse leg cover, you see a duck and then another animal that is hawk-like, basically a bigger bird. The ends of in the upper right and left-hand corners of the purse leg cover look to be the ends of ships. And they are done in a style called horror vacui, which literally means the fear of empty spaces. I have lots of horror vacui to show you in this PowerPoint lecture, so keep a close eye as we go on. These were the gold coins found in the purse in the ship burial at Sutton Hoo. The Vikings were pre-Christian. They like I said, they had their own Norse mythology. They really were the terror of Western Europe. They say they were the terror of Western Europe because they would come in and take over our land, pillage and plunder the civilization, burn houses and take over. They were kind of bullies. The Sutton Hoo ship burial was more than 70 feet long. The vessel contained the remains of 2 women. We already talked about that. It was highly decorated to show that the vessel was a burial that had 2 very important people in it. Here's the hull as it was being discovered and dug up at the residence of the farmer that found it. The dig revealed regalia of an Anglo-Saxon king. Analysis from the soil samples for residual phosphate, which is a chemical that's left behind when a human or animal body has completely decayed away, the samples were taken in 1967 during the British Museum's excavation. This supported the idea that there was a body originally placed in the burial chamber, but it had totally decayed in the acidic conditions in the bottom of the ship. So I'm sorry, my facts got a little bit mixed up there on the last slide, and I was telling you it was dedicated to 2 women. The 2 women were from a different ship burial. This one had a king in it. It is clear that he was of exceptional status. He enjoyed immense personal wealth and more than likely wielded great power. The objects buried with him allow us to glimpse into a sumptuous and sophisticated heroic lifestyle that was brought about vividly by the Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf. The Sutton Hoo ship burial took place around 1400 years ago. So this era of art history is the era in which the poem Beowulf was written. And we know a lot from literary sources, or some from literary sources, about the lifestyle of the Vikings. By the 11th century, most of Scandinavia converts to Christianity, and Viking traditions still persist. This portal, it's a door, is decorated with the animal style. If you look closely, you can see that the representation of the image shows horse-like creatures. The easiest place to see this is in the lower left-hand side of the slide. At the bottom, you have this horse-type creature. His head reaches up and bites the neck of another horse-like creature. So you get this really interesting snaking pattern that goes in and out and undulates back into space. The interlacing pattern is decorative and reflects the sea life that the Vikings would have seen. In the sea life, the plant material is very stringy looking and interlaces. This door is the decoration to a church. You can see at the top, the roof was made of wooden timbers. They're called staves. This is a Norwegian style motif, and it represents the combining of three different Viking traditions. So this syncretism that you're seeing here, where you see three different traditions being represented, is very common in Norse work. It's common because they're traveling a lot, they're picking up different cultures and ideas and bringing them back with them. The Vikings are so nomadic that you sort of get this interesting fusion of styles. So we're going to get ready to look at some Christian manuscript illumination. So I just want to tell you a little bit about manuscript illumination as a whole. As a whole, it was part of the monastic life. The monks that lived there would paint intricate designs on vellum. This practice was an important part of the monastic life, in that the monasteries were the places of education. The monks could read and write as well as the nuns could read and write. The manuscript illuminations are typically a representation of syncretism. We see Christian imagery along with the indigenous imagery that was part of the indigenous culture. So when you're looking at images like the Lindisfarne Gospel, you'll see that the pages tend to be completely covered in pattern, and we call this hora vacui. These pages that are completely covered in pattern are called carpet pages. So this particular work of art is a manuscript illumination. Monasteries were really the epicenter of research and technology. They were the place in which there was time to devote to research and development. They were the places of education, the places that people knew how to read and write. Why? Well, in order to sing from a hymnal, in order to be dedicated to God, one had to be able to read the Bible. They also were people who could write. They wrote so that they could copy multiple versions of the Bible. Most of the monasteries at this point are Benedictine models. The most significant monk in this time period was the Benedict of Nursia. He is the monk that we refer to as Saint Benedict. He lived from 480 to 547 and believed that the corruption of the clergy caused an increasingly worldliness of the church. If the church had roots and the lack of firm organization and regulation, then the church was a strong church. But he felt that the corruption of the clergy was the decline in the church. He believed that idleness and selfishness led to neglect of God and of the church. And the ideal monastery had necessary things for life. Typically, monasteries were small working villages that had things like a flour mill, a bakery, an infirmary, a vegetable garden, a brewery. The monks really had the ability to stay isolated within the monastery and not ever leave the monastery. They were like miniature working cities of monastic tradition. They had libraries and scriptoriums. Libraries are where the books were kept. Scriptoriums were where monks would copy, make copies of the Bible. They would read in the library, and they would design manuscript pages that were fanciful, that were highly decorative. They also bound books and created beautiful ornamental covers, which we're going to see quite a few of. They really became the center of study and research and development. Monasteries were almost the sole repository of what remained of the literary culture of the Greco-Roman world and early Christian world. They had schools. They were self-sufficient production centers. This is the cross-inscribed carpet page from folio 26 verso of the Lindisfarne Gospels from Northumbria, England. It is done in tempera on vellum. It is in the British Library in London. I have seen this cross carpet page. It is really quite beautiful. You can see that the cross sticks out within the design because of the colors. This page is definitely a strong example of hora vacui. You can see the pattern just covers the entire surface of the page. When you look closely at the image, you will see that there is a fusion of Christian imagery mixed with the animal style of Norse warlords. Here's a close-up of the hora vacui, and you can see the snake-like animals that are woven in and out of the linear type design. You can also see that they get a sense of depth based on brightness of color. Each of these pages usually marked something very important that was happening in the Bible. Why? Because at the time, people couldn't read. So in order to announce something like the birth of Christ or the first appearance of Mary, they would have a highly decorated page that marked something important. This is from an unknown manuscript painter at Lindisfarne. Is St. Matthew writing the Gospels from the Lindisfarne Gospels? It is Hiberno-Saxon. You can see that this one is more of a decorative page or a storytelling page. It has a story behind it. You've got this man sitting on a cushion on a Roman style bench. We saw many of these benches in the Second Golden Age of Byzantine. The pillow was something that represented holiness. And then you can see that we get a sense of atmospheric perspective through overlapping. You've got the guy that sits in the front. He wears this really bright cloak that has a very linear pattern to it that reminds us of the way that the Romans dressed. You see this curtain that's being pulled back and one of the apostles looking on to the person writing it. And here is the angel sending messages to the writer. So this is a Cairo Ota page of folio 34 recto of the Book of Kells from Scotland, late 18th, early 19th century. It is tempera on vellum, and it is located at Trinity College in Dublin. It marks the birth of Christ in the Gospel of St. Matthew. It was made by the monks in Ireland who were trying to communicate Christianity to the illiterate. A lot of times, because the monks were trying to communicate Christianity to the illiterate, they will have pages like this that mark important events in the Bible. If you look closely within the page, you'll see many different motifs. I highly encourage you to study this page at depth in terms of its patterning. It'll be in the Delve Deeper activities. If you look, you can see just different patterns that are isolated within itself, like the P for the Cairo Ota. I'm not an expert in Greek lettering, but I think that the Chi is the large P here. And then you can see the patterns within the Chi letter. There's some information at the side of the slide just to give you some background information about the gospel symbols. This is a scriptorium. It is a depiction of the room in which the monks would have copied and read the Bible. You can see that it has sort of a flat depiction with a heavy emphasis on pattern. You can also see that it is in a five-story building, probably the basement, ground level, and 2 upper stories, and then the rooftop story. So this is the equestrian statue of Charlemagne, or Charles the Bald. Charlemagne was king of the Lombards and the Holy Roman Emperor. He takes over at some point here after Justinian goes in and out of power. He was the last great Roman emperor, and his line of succession leads way to a new line of power that stays stable within the empire for some shorter period of time. So we're going to look at Charlemagne a little bit closer here in a moment. So this work of art is probably the most famous of Charlemagne's Gospels. You can see the modulation of light and color within the work of art. The accessories in the painting are familiar Roman things like the chair, the toga that St. Matthew wears. The landscape is a classical feature that was probably taken from a Roman pattern book. This particular gospel is from the Gospel Book of Charlemagne. It is St. Matthew, folio 15 recto of the Coronation Gospels. Coronation Gospels are the Gospels that would have sworn Charlemagne into office. Charlemagne actually moves the capital of Germany to Aachen, the capital of the Roman Empire to Aachen. Why? Well, because at this time, obviously, the Germanic tribes have grown stronger, and they're constantly feeling threat from the Vandals. And so moving to Aachen gives Charlemagne a large presence in that area. This particular work is from the most famous of Charlemagne's Gospels. It's an important book from the Middle Ages because it was used at every coronation of the kings up until the 20th century. The illustrators are from Italy or Byzantium, which is why you get that heavy Roman feeling. It was written in gold ink on purple vellum and underlined the claim that Charlemagne was following the tradition of the Roman emperors. The book was opened at the first page of the Gospel of John and discovered in Charlemagne's tomb in 100 AD by King Otto III. So when we talk about the carpet page from the Lindisfarne Gospels, we usually compare it to St. Matthew folio 18 verso of the Ibo Gospels. It is French. It is an early Carolingian illuminated gospel book, known for its energetic style of illustration. Each page is 10 by 8, and the paintings are from the late classical era. They have a vibrant sense of emotionalism that's distinguishes the Ibo Gospels from the other classic art. Figures from the Ibo's Gospels are presented in a nervous, agitated pose, and the illustrations are unique because they use energetic and swift brush strokes. Generally, historians or the accepted dogma on this work of art has to do with the fact that the brush strokes are so very energetic. You still get this sense of Romanism, right? Because it is similar to the page that we just looked at, in that there's a lectern in which St. Matthew is writing. There's a pillow and a Roman-style desk, but the background's very different. The background seems as if there's a lot of energy going on. We translate this into the fact that the Ibo Gospels was done in an area of the world that was less secure. The Gospels of Charlemagne needed to reflect Charlemagne's power. And so the easiest way to do that is to draw on the power that was already established through the Roman Empire. The new styles, the new vocabulary is something that has been derived from the fusion of the Viking people and the Germanic peoples into the Roman Empire's culture. And so what Charlemagne wants to do is draw back on the classical culture to make himself appear powerful. In the Ibo Gospels, we see more of an influence of the German and Germanic cultures and tribes in the north. You see a sense of anxiety on Matthew's face, as if he's tired. He's been writing for a long time, and he's doing it in a great amount of hurry. His hair is very wiry and barbarian-like. If you think back to our Hellenistic lesson in which we saw the warrior who was from Gaul, the dying Gaul, you get that sense of curly ruggedness in the hair. And so St. Matthew here looks like he's more a member of the barbarian society, and maybe somewhat less stable. Typically, we compare these two works of art together. This will be one of your delve deeper activities, to write me a list of similarities and differences between the two works of art, and to discuss why one of your similarities or differences was important. So this is the front of the Lindau Gospels, from St. Gall in Switzerland. The cover is highly decorated, very fanciful, full of jewels. It has gold pearls. It's surrounded, Christ is surrounded in precious gems. The design of Christ is actually done through repoussé, and then the precious gems that decorate the cover in like they project from the cover, so that when you open the book, the gems hit the surface of the table instead of the art, so that the image of Christ doesn't get squished. This particular work really highlights the stylistic diversity in the early medieval art in Europe. Each of the areas have their own their own signatures in terms of what their art looks like. So each of the different indigenous people have their own specific style. This particular work, like I said, comes from Switzerland. It is, though, today in the Morgan Library in New York City. It is really beautiful. Highly encourage you to go see it if you ever get to go to New York City. The Morgan Library isn't the place that you'd think, oh, yeah, it's the first place I want to go visit when I go to New York City, but it's definitely a gem of New York City. You can see how when the book is opened, it would protect the front, because of needing to protect the cover so very much. These 4 clusters of gems are the main things that sit on the desk to keep the book open, to keep from crushing the repoussé design. Christ is on the front, on the cross. This is it looks like it may have started out as a Greek cross with all 4 points being of equal length, and then they added the border and took up part of the cross that way. This rectangular space with little gem clusters is what I'm talking about, that projects so high from the front of the book to keep from crushing the repoussé design of Christ. You see the halo behind Christ's head that's highly decorated and ornamented, and then there are angels on the front of the cover as well. It was made by St. Gall in Switzerland. In each of the 4 corners, we see the evangelists. This particular book belongs to the Imperial Workshop of Charles the Bald, who was the grandson of Charlemagne. Odo of Metz was Charlemagne's right-hand man and designs a palatine specifically for Charlemagne in Aachen. The palace survives intact today. In fact, one of the Delve Deeper activities is to go on a little tourist jaunt to the town of Aachen and to tour the interior of the church. It's done on a central plan, and because of that, you want to think all the way back to Santa Costanza, when Charlemagne's niece dies and he builds a mausoleum at Santa Costanza not Charlemagne, Constantine's niece dies, and Constantine builds a mausoleum for Santa Costanza. That central church plan of Santa Costanza is carried all the way over to the Palatine of Charlemagne in Aachen, Germany. That was like 2,000 years ago. And Charlemagne decides that he's going to reach back into that bag of tricks, pull that out to liken himself more so to Constantine. Originally, the Palatine had a large courtyard that was 650 feet wide. Official state business was conducted in the palace, and it functioned as the emperor's private chapel. It was modeled off of chapels in Rome and in Constantinople, so not only did they reach back into time to resurrect the floor print of Santa Costanza. They draw on the floor plans for Hagia Sophia and for the Dome of the Rock. These type of builders we call Byzantine builders. And so Odo of Metz is pulling out all the stops when it comes to the Byzantine builders. I'll show you more imagery that likens this particular building to Ravenna. The ground plan is a central plan with an octagonal dome, which has a projecting apse to the east of the dome. The walls were chunky and solid, and the metalwork was especially decorative. The Frankish sort of the thing in that area that is specialized is their metalwork. And so he wanted to draw on the traditions of successful metalwork that we see in that area of the world. Here you can see a close-up of the mosaic work of the Palatine Chapel. This close-up, you can easily see how much the ceiling looks like the chapel at Santa Costanza and at Ravenna. Highly decorative, plant-like material, horror vacui all the way, all done in mosaic. And of course, with lots of beautiful gold highlighting. This is the interior dome of the chapel of the Palatine Chapel. You can see that God sits in the center as King of Heaven, and then the apostles are all around him. There's a clerestory underneath the dome, and you can see the disciples around the clerestory. This rotating pattern of light and dark comes from the Ottoman Empire. This is an establishment that they're trading with the East. You get these Roman columns in each of the barrel vaults. It's very, very Roman, with hints of Middle East and hints of prior Roman builders. Here again, you can see the barrel vaults have rondelles that are portraits of important people within the church. Those rondelles were established in Ravenna at the Church of Justinian. You can see the gold influence from Hagia Sophia with the gilded type walls. When you walked into Charlemagne's palace, you were definitely to be moved and awed at its beauty. The exterior, though, unlike the first golden age of Byzantine buildings, was not plain. It was very ornate, highly decorative, reflected the metal specialties that you see in Belgium and in the area. Here's an exterior shot of the chapel, again, of the palace. You can see that there's a sense of emphasis on elongation, the pointed arches in the window, a sense of highly decorated and ornamented exterior. So this is from the Utrecht Psalter from the Abbey of St. Peter in Hauterville, France. Your textbook claims that it's one of the finest and more memorable in the early medieval manuscripts. The text reproduces the Psalm of King David. The artist reproduces each psalm with pen and ink, sketching across the entire span of the book. So where we normally have that central spine, he uses the entire width of the book to draw. It was thought by scholars that it follows other books that predated about 400 years, which made the book appear ancient. It was a common aspiration in the age of Charlemagne to make something appear old and classical. And you can see that old classical style exists in the sepia tones, in the way that the soldiers are dressed. I challenge you to find 10 things that draw back on classical history in this work of art. It is definitely a reinforcer of the fact that Charlemagne tried to resurrect everything that was classical era. So this church was constructed in 873 AD and located in modern day Germany. It is an early medieval era church. It has 2 levels, and worship takes place on both levels. It acts as a church within a church because it has multiple altars. The emperor and company would watch and worship from the nave. This is the Abbey Church in Corvey, Germany. You can see how flat the exterior of the building is, but how they are focusing on height and big, bulky, chunky, thick walls. Well, Charlemagne passes away, and a new empire begins. Charlemagne's empire really dies out after he dies, and then his grandsons disperse throughout the empire and aren't able to continue his strong, powerful hold on the empire. The Vikings drive out the power of Charlemagne, and a new Saxon line takes over in 100 AD. They are called the Etonians. There were 3 Etonian kings, and they all preserved the Carolingian traditions that Charlemagne's empire developed and enhanced them, adding traditions of their own. Monastic reform divided the church monastic reform was developed for churches under the Etonians, and the Etonians aligned with Italy and the papacy. It's a really important thing. They bridged the gap between France and Italy because Charlemagne was so very much opposed to their power. He felt that they were his enemy, and here the Etonians come along, make nice with the Lombards, and align Italy with the papacy. The culture's renewed for a short period of time, and we get a nice, powerful empire for a short time. This is the nave of the Church of Saints Krickedus in Germany. This is the best preserved church of the 10th century of the Etonian basilicas. The nave is the first in Western Europe to incorporate a gallery between the clerestory and the ground floor. That gallery is really important. It's that center row of barrel vaults that you see. That gallery is taken all the way into the Gothic churches. The church uses an alternative support system, meaning that the heavy square piers at the front and the back of the church are what really carry the weight of the entire building. You can see them here. They look like, well, you know what? I will draw an arrow for you so you can see exactly what I mean by those heavy piers. Those are going to be really important. They are the basis of the Romanesques building practices. We're not quite to Romanesque yet, but they are a foreshadow of what will come. This is the Abbey Church of St. Michael's in Hildesheim, Germany. It was designed by Bishop Bernward. Bernward was the patron that funded the church. He had great design influence over the Abbey Church. He follows the lead of the Carolingian Church, but adds his own elements to St. Michael's. He liked the style of the upward towers and the massive thick walls, but he adds a second transept. We're going to look at that on the floor map here in a minute. Because he wants to visually balance the church more equally. He is an architect, and he was friends with Otto the third, I believe, or Otto was his pupil, one of the two. I'll clear that up for you in just a minute. Regardless, he had a close relationship with Otto, who was the Ottonian king. And so Otto says, yeah, go ahead and redesign the church. Let's look at the floor plan. So in the floor plan, you can see that this church has two transept crossings. Remember, the transept crossings is that area that looks like the arm of the church. The main area in the center is the nave. And then the transept is where the cross comes across the church. I will label that and use arrows for you there. You see that he widens the nave and adds a side aisle. The widening of the nave goes to allow for the entrances to be on the side of the church. This was a throwback to the ancient classical days of the Roman Empire. It draws on the Basilica Oppia that was designed in the Forum of Trajan. Again, just like the church that we just looked at in Germany, there are heavy piers at each side of the transept that carry the weight of the entire building. Bernward establishes these new building techniques. And he also popularizes certain important architectural elements that become sort of in fashion and followed through with by the Romanesque church. For one thing, there's an ambulatory aisle that goes all the way around the church that one can enter the building in, walk all the way around the church, and exit the building without having to disturb what's going on in the center. Maybe there's church going on, maybe there's some sort of feast day and there's a ceremony being performed. And so people can come into the church, walk all the way around the church, and then exit the church, even when there's something major going on in the church. The heavy piers in each of the corners are an alternative support system that allow for the timber roofs to begin appearing more and more. You can see that this roof is highly decorative. I'll show you a close-up here. This is the interior of the church. You see those red and white striped large piers in front of you. Those are the piers that carry that weight. This red and white stripe, once again, is influence from the Middle East, and its influence that we attribute to Islam. It is a pattern that sort of aligns the current leadership with being at peace with the Middle East and with the Lombards. You can see the ceiling is made of wood and it has been painted, and then there is a clerestory at the top. These are the doors with relief panels from the Abbey Church at St. Michael's of Hildesheim. The Hildesheim doors were more than 15 feet tall and made of bronze. They were technological marvels because they were cast individually with the relief element all in one piece. The right door recounts the life of Christ. The left door illustrates and highlights from the book of Genesis. Together, the doors tell the story of sin and redemption, the fall and rise of man. The composition of many of the scenes are derived from the Carolingian manuscript illuminations, and in one panel, God is portrayed as a man. The scenes are presented with simplicity but great emotional impact. Bernward was a lover of the arts and an expert bronze caster. He was the guest of King Otto III in Rome. Otto was Bernward's pupil, so Otto took lessons from the bishop. He would have seen monuments like the Column of Trajan in Rome, and we think that that's part of why it's a narrative. These are narrative door panels that tell a story just like the Column of Trajan. The churches of Rome would have influenced him as well. The doors cast in one single piece is a technological marvel because remember, those technologies had been lost when Rome fell. The doors were the first of its kind in terms of the large-scale sculpture, and they predict new innovation to implement large-scale sculpture as time goes on. This is an ivory plaque that comes from a group of ivories called the Madberg ivories, and they are ivories that were done for King Otto II. To the right, you will see Theophanu, who was an empress consort of Byzantium. Otto I arranged the marriage between Theophanu and Otto II. Otto II was Holy Roman Emperor from 973 to 983, and he was the youngest and sole surviving son of Otto the Great and Adelaide of Italy. The Madberg ivories were a group of panels that combined characteristics of the Metz ivories from the second half of the 9th century and characteristics from the Romanesque. There are 16 panels in the ivory group, and they depict the life cycle of Christ. Just like in the Empress Zoe mosaic that we saw in Byzantium, a lot of times the donor is pictured with Christ. This would have been common practice, but they're definitely reaching back into their bag of tricks to align themselves with the classical era. You can see that the architecture in the Madberg ivory seems to have Roman influence with the Corinthian columns and the turning spiral columns to the right and the left. You see the highly decorated stools that support their feet. And of course, Jesus is standing on the tallest stool with Theophanu to his right and Otto to his left, I believe. This is the Giro crucifix, and it's called the Giro crucifix because it was commissioned by Archbishop Giro. It's carved in oak and painted and gilded. It is 6 feet tall, 2 inches wide. That doesn't make sense. It's 6 feet tall. Oh, I'm sorry. The height of the figure alone is 6 feet tall. So I would imagine if the figure is 6 feet tall, it's going to be 6 feet wide in terms of the span of the arms. You can see that Jesus hangs on the cross after having been crucified, his belly swollen with blood. There's a sense of realism that comes from this crucifix, but a lot less ornate than the works of art that we saw coming from Charlemagne's empire. There was a compartment in the back that held bread for the Eucharist, and Jesus is depicted having human life with blood dripping down his forehead, an expression of pain on his face, and his body appears limp, so in the dying process. Above his head are the letters that say King of the Jews, and the halo behind his head is a Byzantine throwback. This style of art is somewhat realistic, but a lot less ornate than some of the art that we've seen in the past. It is because it comes from a different era. It is Ottonian. Ottonian art is jeweled, but simpler than the art that we see from Charlemagne's time. This is Otto III enthroned. It is folio 27 recto of the Gospel Book of Otto III from Germany. The Gospel Book contains some of the finest medieval paintings of Jesus' life. One page of the book shows figures conforming to a Christian imperial iconographic tradition. Otto III wanted a revival of the Christian Roman tradition and moved his court to Rome and set up symbols of Roman imperialism while he was there. The Ottonian kings have a style of art that's a little bit more simple. It has bold colors, it has bolder shapes. It's not quite as foo-foo as the Carolingian art. So this is the Annunciation to the Shepherds folio in the lectionary of Henry II from Germany. It's a gospel manuscript that was commissioned by Henry II for Bamberg Cathedral. There's a poem and a full-page miniature in which Henry and his wife are crowned by Christ. And there are enamels of the evangelist symbols made specifically for the cover. You can see the heavy gold leafing in the background and the medieval way in which they treat the clothing. It's interesting because it's a medieval style in that it's very linear and emphasizes the way the body moves underneath the clothing, which is a throwback to classical antiquity with the wet drapery. It creates this heavy reliance on line to convey the body shape, as well as they rely heavily on line to convey the shape of the landscape and convey gesture of the angel. This is the Uta Codex. Parts of the gospel. It contains the parts of the gospel that are read during church. So it would have been necessary to have there so that as they were going through the gospel, there was something for the illiterate to focus on. This is Abbess Uta dedicating her codex to the Virgin Mary. It is folio to recto of the Uta Codex in Regensburg, Germany from 1025. The chapters are grouped according to the author and not the calendars. So all of the Gospel of Luke is together. All of the Gospel of St. Matthew is together. 4 whole pages illustrate the hand of God. Uta dedicates the Codex to Mary and Jesus, and St. Bernhard celebrates Mass. Just all in that one illustration. You can see the Horo Vacui represented here, as well as the highly decorative panel. A little bit more simple than the early medieval works that we saw, but definitely still beautiful and highly textured.